You're here today with me. I'm Joan Jerkovich, your life coach here on News Radio 1150 KSAL. And I'm going to be talking today about loving your inner child. And this comes from one of my callers coming up later in the show who talks about how he's had to do what he calls inner child work. And I'm going to describe for you what that actually means because he's had some issues with his mother from when he was growing up. Now, when you hear about this idea of the inner child, this kind of became popularized by John Bradshaw, who's one of those U.S. educators. Some people call him, kind of the father of pop psychology. He's a self-help movement leader. And he was the one who famously kind of coined that inner child jargon that you hear in the pop psychology movement. And what that actually means, as described by John Bradshaw, is that these are those childhood experiences that remain unresolved. They come from those lingering dysfunctional effects of a dysfunctional childhood. And in that way, the inner child then refers to all of the sum of the mental and emotional memories stored in the subconscious, all the way from the time you were born until you go through puberty. That's what his definition of the inner child is. And I wanted to put that definition out there for you so you knew where we were going with this and what we're talking about. Now, I'm going to give credit again where credit's due because I want to talk about Louise Hay. Louise is a woman who, let's almost say her going into her retirement years, decided to start a publishing house, which they call Hay House. And it now has some very famous authors that she publishes through. And that would be one of the most famous would be Wayne Dyer. And another one that I'm personally familiar with is Cheryl Richardson. And that is because she is one of the longest standing life coaches who has more of her books published through Hay House than anyone. And I've actually had the opportunity to go see her and meet her, at least say hi to her at one of her lectures out in Denver, Colorado. Going back to Louise Hay, I found an interesting article she wrote where she talked about releasing the hurts of your past, where there is a little child within all of us who needs love and acceptance. In this writing, Louise talks about how children, when something goes wrong, will tend to grasp onto the idea and believe that there's something wrong with them. That sounds familiar, I'm sure, to many of you out there who might be listening to this. Yes, when something goes wrong, we tend to blame ourselves. And especially if we have those parents in our lives or come from that dysfunctional family I was talking about, where the children are sort of blamed, or it's like, it's your fault your dad and I aren't getting along, or it's your fault that, your mom drinks too much. Unfortunately, some of those children that we've talked to, and I've talked to many of them here on my life coaching show, especially those women who came from the homeless shelter that I've talked to, and those are the ones who had no functioning parenting. The crack mom laying on the couch all day, that was the kind of parenting they had. So you can imagine how their inner child, and many of them also had to, maybe if they were an older child, take care of their siblings, were very wounded by the lack of parenting that they had to live through. Now, Louise Hay was talking about how the parent in us scolds our own child almost nonstop. And this is what she's calling inner dialogue, where we can hear that scolding. We can hear us telling ourselves, the parent in us telling our inner child that you're not good enough. And these are messages that were carried over from probably that dysfunctional upbringing. Now, let me share with you from John Bradshaw's book, Homecoming, Reclaiming and Championing Your Inner Child, where he talks about the actual process you need to go through to heal your wounded inner child. And he puts it down into 6 steps. And the primary premise he talks about of healing this inner child is one of grief and grieving. But the first part of that step has to be, number 1, trust. Trust is imperative that you have, that your inner child can come to the table, so to speak, in finding a supportive, a non-shaming ally in you within your own psyche that's going to validate the fact that, yes, you were really traumatized and you were really hurt, maybe neglected, abused, or abandoned by a parent or lack of parenting in your childhood. Trust is the number 1 step in healing. Number 2, he mentions, is validation. Yes, you need validation to recognize and realize that your parents did probably shame you. They ignored you. They maybe used you for their own needs. They used you as their sounding board, maybe. You need now to accept the fact that these were things that truly did wound your soul. It's not that your parents were bad people. It's just that they were wounded in their own right. The third step in healing your inner child is shock and anger. Bradshaw writes that it's okay to be angry, even if what your parents or what was done to you was unintentional. In fact, you have to be angry as part of the process of healing. Listen to what he shares about what a wounded child wrote. This person wrote, "I know that my parents did the best that two wounded adult children could do, but I'm also aware that I was deeply wounded spiritually and that it's had life-damaging consequences for me. What that means is that I hold us all responsible to stop what we're doing to ourselves and to others. I will not tolerate the outright dysfunction and abuse that dominated my family system." Now, that was a mouthful, so let me kind of paraphrase what that statement was trying to say. Number one, we recognize that the parents did the best they could. Number two, yes, I was deeply wounded by those damaging consequences of that dysfunction. Number three, we all have to have some responsibility to stop not only what we're doing to ourselves, and I take that as that self-talk we mentioned earlier, but also what we might be doing to others. And number four, I will no longer tolerate this dysfunction and abuse that dominated my family system. Shock and anger are number three. Let's go to number four, sadness. Because after you process that anger, and I'm sure you can identify with this from something you've had where you got so angry, but underneath that was that incredible hurt and sadness, especially if there was something you were personally victimized by. You have to grieve the hurt. You have to grieve that betrayal, because what it does to you, especially if it happens as an inner child, is that it basically changes everything about us. It changes something in us. And I know I've heard other people talk about when children witness or are abused, it changes who they are. It can maybe make change to their dreams or their aspirations. They can certainly have needs that come off as unfulfilled. The next step to healing your inner child is going to be remorse. Now, what does remorse mean? It means having deep regret or feeling guilty. And this is also going to be part of this grieving process. What they're grieving when you feel remorse in this fifth step is that you're grieving that maybe you were abandoned as a child. The important part of this step is to realize that there was nothing you as a child could have done differently. You were truly a victim. The sixth and final step toward healing is loneliness, because at the deepest of core feelings that you might have with your grieving process are this toxic shame and loneliness. Your inner child can feel so flawed and so defective, and this is a truly difficult place to be in. But as author John Bradshaw would say, this is where you need to stay with this last layer of painful feelings, even though it may be the hardest part of this whole grieving process, because the only way out is through. You're going to need to embrace those feelings you have so that you can come out on the other side. And embracing your shame and loneliness, you will eventually find your true self. Coming up next on the show, I want to tell you what Louise Hay says is the number one single most important thing you need to heal your inner child. That's the Joan Jerkovich Show here on 1150 KSAL.